I've been asked to set the scene. I think I should straight away cut to the chase because I think we have an excellent panel session that's going to happen. So I'm going to learn a lot. But given the responsibility, I'm just going to say a few words and then sort of slip away. From an economics perspective, I think when we think about the origins of a modern state, the primary question a state was trying to solve was actually centered around food security. In fact, what's really interesting is that there are two approaches, to what a state does. One was centered around food security, building canals, irrigation, making sure food is available in the larger public interest. And the other approach to state was that it's an efficient war-making machine. That is the bellicose theory. And it's interesting in this forum that I'm hearing both sides. At one end, state as a very efficient instrument for extending the interest of the country, extending through foreign policy, though it's not very clear-cut what an interest of a country is. But today what we want to discuss essentially is another important aspect of the state, which is centered around food security. And I think this is the modern theory of the state that is emerging, that on a day-to-day basis, the state tries to solve in the larger public interest. Basically, the legitimacy of the state comes in resolving conflicts centered primarily around issues of food. It could be fuel. Now technology is emerging, but still food remains a very important aspect of what the state does. In India, I think historically food security since independence has been a major concern. We started a green revolution when it occurred to us very early on that we have to be self-reliant on food. And the green revolution, the success of it was that the technology existed. It didn't exist in India, it existed elsewhere, Mexico, US. But what we lacked was a political will to adapt the technology. But at the same time, what was really advantageous was that the Green Revolution became a political movement because we had to convince millions and millions of farmers to adopt the new technology. Farmers are typically very conservative, and that was not an easy task, and India was able to achieve that. So I think Green Revolution was a remarkable success in terms of building food security in India. In the last decade, I think food security has moved in a very different direction in India because Green Revolution was a supply-side movement in India. But now in the last decade, particularly under the leadership of Prime Minister Modi, the food security has become an issue of entitlement. It is a right-based approach to food, where in our constitution, the state is required. If people demand food, the state is required to provide food. India runs one of the largest social safety net program in terms of the right to food program, where more than 800 million people are covered. I mean, this is a remarkable feat. I mean, 800 million people is several countries, put together, the top 5 or 6 countries put together would have a population. And one must understand that it's not that we are feeding 800 million people. This is also the time in India where actually demand for free food is coming down. But it is the capacity that the state has developed that it can actually reach out to 800 million people. And this was very ably demonstrated during the pandemic. And what was remarkable about the pandemic was that it was not as if people were reaching out and getting food from the government. The government was trying to ensure that the entitlements reached the people. So effectively, our technological revolution, what we call the digital public infrastructure, was also, it's a remarkable revolutionary feat because for the first time, for entitlements, for the rights, people don't reach out to the government. The government is directly reaching out to the people. This reversal, not only, in some sense is a technological marvel, but it preserves the dignity of poor people. Previously in India, we would have a poverty parade outside government offices where people are basically, even for their own entitlement, they would have to line up. But I think one of the biggest movement, and I think this is what has happened in terms of where the political culture has changed, is that we've made people, individuals, particularly low-income, poor people, we've made them the center of the politics. And the effort has been by the government to reach out to them. So in some sense, I think as far as India is concerned, food security, we've had a supply side revolution, but now we are also doing a demand side revolution using technology. One of the things that I would like to say is that in India, the nature of food consumption, in fact, we wrote a report for the Prime Minister's Economic Advisory Council. We wrote a report on what India eats. What we have witnessed in the last decade, due to massive investments in infrastructure, roads, rail, is India is moving away from consumption of cereals into more nutritionally rich diet. I mean, you will be surprised to know that the poorest 20% of India 10 years ago, only 30 to 40% of them ate any fruit in a given month. 30 to 40%. Now that number has almost crossed 90%. So a massive improvement in infrastructure and development has made food affordable and accessible. And we are not talking about just cereals, wheat and rice, but we are talking about fresh fruits, we are talking about egg, fish and meat, we are talking about milk in some sense. So the demand side aspect of the revolution in India has also been very, very remarkable, because you must keep in mind that India is a population of 1.4 billion people. Geographically, it is very diverse. If you look at what India eats, there's not one diet. I mean, there are, if not thousands, but hundreds of different diets. The northern part of India eats very differently. Within the south, you could have distinction. Within the state itself, there will be distinct diet being consumed in the northern part of the state. The coastal part of the state eats very differently. The southern part of the state eats very differently. So the magnitude of the problem that we've been trying to solve vis-a-vis food has been a problem of scale. Technologies can exist, but adapting, getting it to the grassroots level for more than 1 billion people is where India's challenge is. And to be very honest, I think the political environment has made it possible. Of course, Prime Minister Modi is delivering on the promises to the people, but one must admit that the right-based approach to entitlement was the creation of the previous government. What Prime Minister Modi, because of his experience in Gujarat as a chief minister, and prior to that, he being a local politician, has understood that you can give rights to people, but if you cannot enforce those rights, if you cannot deliver on those rights, then people's faith in those rights and the constitution itself could be eroded, because then you can make laws which look very good, but there's no way you are implementing or enacting or enforcing those laws. So the government of India basically has made sure that if it has given entitlements, they're also delivered. India is now moving away from food security. We are moving towards nutrition security. I think that is the big issue that one must take into account, because of the development in infrastructure and development, as I previously said, infrastructure and road, cold storages, it is now possible for India to move towards solving the nutrition security issue. Because in India, we do have certain problems which are big problems. For example, prevalence of anemia. Prime Minister has announced that India is going to be free of anemia, which basically means having iron-rich food easily accessible and available to people. And iron comes, we have a panelist from Rajasthan. Iron comes from different sources, but we want iron from sources other than cereals. We want iron to be coming from egg, fish, and meat, from fruits, from vegetables. This nutrition security is now being given a lot of emphasis in the government policy program. So I think food security is extremely important. India's history in this has been from supply side to demand side. It's extremely important for strengthening the state. It's extremely important for the welfare of the people. And our problem is one of scale, which I think we are delivering upon. We've been subjected to several shocks. But if it is one thing where security has been provided to people, it is in terms of food being made available. So with those opening remarks, I'm going to stop here. And we have an existing panel, excellent panel, that more meaningful questions. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Madhut. That was a very good perspective from the Indian experiences. And thank you, everyone. Today's panel is about seeds of change and rethinking food security. Very important because the word seeds is what is important is how we plant it and what we do afterwards with it. So watering the lessons from the lessons learned that will be shared today will be very important. So on that note, we're going to turn straight to, and we'll go in the order of where we're sitting. So with Robert, we'll start with you. From the standpoint of an agri-tech company, what is the role of the stakeholders in multilateral forums such as this that plays an important role in fostering the resilience as well as, you know, the sustainable agri-food systems from a local perspective? And if you could just share some of the lessons from Cote d'Ivoire's experience. So over to you. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you, Pamela, and good afternoon, everybody. It's a pleasure to be on another panel for Rhizina. And thanks for the question. As was introduced, I represent one of many private companies that involved in research and development for the development of agri-technology around the world. If we take a step back and we look at APAC specifically, within the context of food security, the glaring thing that always steps out to us is why is producibility so much lower in APAC than it is in the developing nations? And it's very clear. There are parts of Asia where we have very high yields and production is globally competitive, but in general it is lower. And there's many reasons for that, but the most fundamental reason is to scale up food production in a very fragmented and smallholder market is very complicated. There's many challenges for farmers, whether it's access to market, credit, technology, irrigation, agronomy, extension, supply chain, storage, the list goes on and on. But scaling up agriculture in this part of the world, and I think there are some Brazilians here relative to, say, Mato Grosso, where you have a 100,000 acre soybean farm, is very, very difficult. And no single company, no single entity can achieve that. What we see and what we are really positive to see across this region, and it plays very well to the introduction, is the concept of cooperation and collectivism, where organizations, private, public, come together with academia and government to support smallholder farmers get access to information and technology that helps them improve production. And one of the key examples that we see developing is in India right now. The FPO structure, the Farmer Producer Organization, is an Indian government initiative. They have a stated aim to have 10,000 of these across the country at the village level, trying to help farmers overcome the hurdles that I listed before. So we see, as you introduced very well, the government is responsible for creating these structures. We as entities are responsible for serving those structures with the technology, the information, the education that we have. We've worked with FPOs in India for the last few years in a very successful way, and I'm very pleased to see in Indonesia here a very similar cooperative structure now being created called the Koperasi Metaputi, which again is a co-op structure. And we very much look forward, as I'm sure many other entities do, in working within this collectivism structure to help small farmers get access to information, credit, technology that helps them increase their producibility and productivity to help us with domestic food security.
Thank you so much, Robert. Operative word, collectiveness. So I think that's important. From a perspective of food security in terms of, sorry, my pages are flying all over. Let me turn over to you, Judith. And Judith, from a perspective of Kenya, food security actually touches both on macro and the micro perspective. So if you can please share in terms of the national food policies from a Kenyan's point of view, specifically on small scale farmers, and as well as touching on the agenda of the post-30 to ensure food systems and more resilient, equitable, and responsive future. So if you can just share from your perspective on this topic, on the post-30 agenda and sustainable food systems.
Thank you, Pamela, and good afternoon, everybody. First, I want to thank the ORF team and CSIS for organizing this forum, and in particular for having this panel as we discuss food security and way forward. Speaking from a Kenyan perspective, and largely the Horn of Africa, where food security is actually an issue we must tackle before we think about any other development agenda, and where we're grappling with the reality of having to feed our population, but not just having to feed them, but doing so sustainably. And looking at macro versus micro, most of what we have is very good policies, good on paper, well articulated, but the implementation of the same is not exactly encouraging, because a lot of times these policies are done, but with very little involvement of the people at the grassroots, who are the people that should determine and define what next for this. And therefore, at the macro level, the policies are good, but at the micro level, that is at the household, at the community level, these are not exactly speaking to the reality at the ground or speaking to the actual issues and challenges at the ground. And therefore, there is need to include grassroots voices and local and indigenous knowledge in the design of policy to make sure that these policies are able to speak into the needs. And noting that a lot of our communities for a lot of our communities, there is no one-size-fits-all intervention to ensure food security. And this is because we have different agroecological zones, different crops, different food systems. So solutions need to be tailor-made for every individual community need. And therefore, part of the biggest challenges is exactly that, not having the voice and indigenous knowledge into design of macro policies for food security. And like our scene setter said, when we think about food security, we need to move from thinking about just food security, but incorporate nutrition security into what we're thinking of in terms of policy. And therefore, even as we look at the 4 pillars of food security, there is access, utilization, stability, and availability. Nutrition security must take center stage in this. And speaking into how we have to, how and what we can do to ensure that food systems are more resilient, equitable, and responsive to future shocks post-2030. We need to recenter food sovereignty, not just food security. And as we look at food sovereignty, we need to anchor into the strengths, the knowledge of local communities. And beyond that, empower communities to define resilience and what it looks like for them. Resilience must be defined culturally, ecologically, and nutritionally, recognizing that to protect informal food systems, indigenous knowledge and food security have to lead. Again, remembering that for most of the Kenyan food systems are run by women, gender must also be brought into, and this speaks into where we should go post-2030 and how we should design our policies for food. And even as we prioritize indigenous women, farmers, we need also to anchor into collectives and what farmer producer organizations, women producer organizations, and indigenous farmers have been able to do to bring themselves together. And not just bring themselves together, but to work together to ensure that within their own local communities, they're able to ensure food security. Again, food security and ensuring food security does not stop at borders. Therefore, from a global South perspective, we have to foster solidarity, meaning in terms of research, a lot of South-South cooperation to see how we can work amongst ourselves from the global South, and not just work amongst ourselves, but do a lot of knowledge sharing in terms of research, do a lot of information sharing, and encourage regional food reserves to reform our trade and support fair, climate-compatible food systems across the global South. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Judith. It's good actually to hear when it comes to food security, more and more we're talking about the aspect of nutrition because, before it was not so much involved in terms of how food production is done. It's basically, it was about the accessibility. So that's important. And later we'll come back to you also during the break. You spoke about something about Kenya being 2/3 dry land. I think it'll be important to share your perspective on that. But Siobhan, let's turn over to you in terms of, again, the post-2030 agenda and from a Sri Lankan point of view, if you can just share the responsiveness to future shocks from your experiences. Thank you.
Thank you, Pamela, and good afternoon, everybody. Thank you, RF, for having me. Look, I don't come from the international development world, so I don't really understand much of the jargon. I've had enough of multilateralism, unilateralism, bilateralism to last a lifetime, being part of the RF road trip for a couple of months now. But what I'm going to talk to you about is a very practical perspective of working with the people of Sri Lanka over a period of 3 decades, as part of my work in the media and also as part of my work in a grassroots movement in Sri Lanka. Look, I mean, if any of you switched on the news this morning, you might have heard that today we don't celebrate, but I guess we recognize a very significant day in our recent history. And that is, it's 80 years since the atom bomb was dropped on Hiroshima, to this day, at 8:15 this morning. And I think that left an indelible mark on human history, but also on human consciousness. What we do to ourselves and the impact of what we do to ourselves can be long-lasting. It lasts forever. And coming from a small island nation like Sri Lanka, I can tell you that what we have in that nation in terms of our resources should not result in the kind of abject food insecurity that we experienced over the past 5 or 6 years. We are a nation of 106 rivers and a heritage, a hydraulic heritage that goes back 3,000 years. Sri Lankan hydraulic engineers built sustainable systems, irrigation systems, over 3,000 years ago that last to this day and serve humankind in Sri Lanka to this day. In fact, they irrigate fields even today. It's too complicated to go into the exact description of these systems, but they're not linear systems. They are water reservoirs that were built not just to convey water from A to B, but to also nourish the environment. And in actual fact, the whole philosophy of sustainability is that you leave something in a better state than when you began. And that is the philosophy that has fed our people in my country for thousands of years. To go from there to where we found ourselves post-2020, not just because of COVID, but because of a lot of the things that we did to ourselves over the past many decades, is unbelievable. Sri Lanka faced a currency depreciation of 80%, and that resulted in food inflation of over 90%. And that immediately placed the majority of the population at massive risk, bringing this country down to its knees, making us dependent on everybody and anybody. The economic imperatives of food security and insecurity is unbelievable, and I've seen it with my own eyes. When human dignity is exchanged for food, when hunger is the critical aspect we're dealing with, dignity goes out of the window. And you'd borrow, you'd beg from anybody. And that's what we had to do. And I am determined to ensure that Sri Lanka is never in that same place again. And here's why Sri Lanka is important, my friends. It's not an isolated story. Sri Lanka might be a little island in the middle of the Indian Ocean, but if we are talking about all of these regional cooperation organizations, ASEAN and the Indo-Pacific, which appeared about 6 or 7 years ago from nowhere, well, we are as strong as our weakest link. And here's why Sri Lanka is important. We're like the silent, secret Suez Canal. We have 35,000 shipping vessels pass by our southern coast every year. 4,500 oil tankers. Over 45,000 airplanes fly over our exclusive economic zone. That's a serious choke point, and an unstable Sri Lanka is a problem not just to the region, but the world. And so there's an economic imperative, and also there is a climate imperative. All of the pollution that is released by these vessels and these airplanes and ships, we pay a price for it. The estimate is that Sri Lanka will lose up to 25% of its fish yield by 2050. And that's going to have serious implications on Sri Lankans' food security and just people's livelihoods. And so these things have to be taken very seriously if we are interested in this global system or a regional system that is supposed to ensure prosperity and growth and equitability to all parts of our region. And so I think it's important that we take a philosophical look at this as well. I think it's important to have an ideological basis for all of the important discussions we're having, and that ideological basis should be the philosophy of sustainability. It's not just talking about the tools that make things sustainable, but also what is sustainability in a real sense. And I think, I know I sound like a patriot talking only about the Sri Lankan experience, but that's all I know, that's what I know. And I think it's a story worth telling, in that when you approach sustainability with the idea that we want to leave something better than when we started, I think that's a very, very important starting point. So as the world gets more complex, and as the world gets more dynamic, and as we're all grappling to face everything that's going on at such a rapid pace, I think going back to philosophy and understanding what it is we're actually trying to achieve and do here together becomes that much more important. And I think, I don't know how many of you noticed, but the elevator has this digital screen advertising restaurants and stuff, and all of a sudden, out of nowhere, pops this Jim Rohn quote. I don't know if you saw it, but it says, "The way to change your life, the way to a brighter future is not by chance, but by change." And I think if we change the way we look at things, the things we look at will change. Thank you.
Thank you, Siobhan, for that very practical intervention. I think it really, really showcases our actions today and how that will change our tomorrow. And you might be one patriot, but 10 million of you can make a difference, I think. So thank you for that. We'll turn now to Shivi, and for your question from a India perspective, and as the scene was set earlier, I think you can contribute to that from the rural, small-scale farming approach in terms of India's procurement-led model and Indonesia's targeted tech-based in terms of how this and what can it contribute to the Indo-Pacific, and what can we learn from both these differing pathways of food security. Over to you.
Great question. I think it's, I'm well seated. I represent the last mile. For some of you who don't know about me, I've worked as the head of a village council in a small village in Rajasthan in India. And I'd like to believe that I represent the voices of the people at the grassroots, especially the farmers and the people who suffer the most when trade policies, or rather policies per se, change. So I think it's good that I'm speaking after Shivan. And from what he said, I think what stands out to me is that national food policies today almost feel like battlefields, not for ideologies, but for sheer survival. And that's what I think we need to change our perspective towards, to ensure that given the region that we are representing, I think we also have a similar civilizational identity where we have similar values and something common that we strive towards. And therefore, it only makes sense that we do not get bullied by the West or by the people or leaders who are using economics to dominate us, but in actuality, come together not to create a footnote, but to write our own chapters. And for that, I think it is important we work towards a collective crisis protocol. And I think the solutions are actually very simple. It's not rocket science. But what can we do to come together and to ensure that with food security, we're not just taking care of ourselves who are seated in the room, because when it comes to negotiating at that larger scale, we're not the ones who suffer. We are privileged. But those who are not, who are so far removed from negotiating in any which way, are the ones who suffer. and not just suffer in terms of not getting the adequate supply of nutrition, which we're talking of, but it's about the sheer survival, because often they get lost and often lives are lost. And that is not what we want. That's what I feel we need to come together towards. So coming back to the question, I think, again, given that we are rather similar in many ways, and as Mudit pointed out, as he set the tone for the discussion, that India, given the scale, given the immense diversity, it's actually like many states are equivalent to many countries that come together to find a common solution. And it's just fascinating how the large procurement and the distribution system that India has is almost like running a Michelin star restaurant, because you're providing food to the very last mile to every individual. And it's fascinating how we do that. Not that it's perfect, given that it's the large scale that we have to address, but the beauty of how now with the slow digital revolution that I feel is coming in, especially in the rural sector. And that's the change we're witnessing. That's the change I feel that can dramatically make a more positive an impact, provided we use it rightfully. And in that, I think it is very important that the last mile voices are heard. And I think that's something that the digital space can provide, the infrastructure, if laid out properly, and policies made such that the voices of the people are heard, that the changes and the shifts can happen. As again, India, the current government has done beautifully from distribution of ensuring that calories were supplied. Now it is nutrition that is supplied, because we have very interesting methodologies where people themselves contribute towards ensuring that the distribution happens and the food security, including nutrition, is provided to almost every individual living in the remotest of villages in India. And for that, I think what has worked beautifully and is improving the system, which I understand Indonesia has been able to do with its digital platform. So if we were to incorporate that and complement each other in terms of what the two countries have themselves been able to execute, and see our unique methodologies as once complementing each other, and therefore all the more reason why we need to come together, is that if we use that kind of technology that ensures that wastage is reduced, and what India has already been able to do so well and beautifully, especially now with agri-startups, we're using AI, we're using blockchain, improving logistics, and even drones to ensure that has enabled precision farming. Alongside that, in villages, for example, we have what we call Anganwadi workers, which are people from within the villages who are taught the basics of understanding what the requirement of every individual needs to be and address those. And not just by providing the required ration or the food supply, but also the knowledge, so that every individual, be it a woman or a child, also understands what they are falling short on. And that is the feedback through the technology, the feedback mechanism that allows for the policy to change and improvise. And therefore, the now procurement in itself is more diverse, because diversity is what will then therefore ensure that nutrition is rightfully provided. So from millets, which is locally grown, has been a traditional grain, to including fruits, etc., and vegetables, to the table of the people who otherwise, in regions like mine, which does not have enough rainfall, we cannot grow vegetables in many of our regions. So that is therefore provided by the state, by the government, to ensure that every individual gets what they need. So this is just a simple example. Alongside midday meal, which I understand Indonesia has recently incorporated, again, I think that can be tweaked even further, because as a farmer or someone who works with farmers, what I'm seeing is that the next generation does not want to grow food. They do not want to do farming. And that, I think, is the biggest challenge we are going to face if we lose that link as far as food security is concerned. So it is important that we introduce it to the young people to children going to school. So midday meal, for example, this is something that I have been advocating as much as I possibly can in my own country, where we need to introduce the concepts of farming to young children so they can grow their own crops, or not necessarily crops, their own vegetables, for example, in a kitchen garden, which can run within the same school premises. So they are sensitized and made to understand how food grows and why it is important to nurture and nourish nature around us, given how crazy climate change impact is going to be, not just locally, but even globally. So what can we do? So these are small, simple steps that I feel states or governments can take up to ensure that food security is something that is made more robust, more and strengthened a lot more, not just with technology, but even with individuals, with the next generation participating towards growing all of that. And I think the greatest strength, which if I were to cite India's example, has been for the ability of the government to buffer price shocks and guarantee the access across the country and even to the neighboring states during crisis. And I think pandemic was not the best space to be in, but a great example on how countries came together to help each other out. So having lived through that, I think it only is common sense to understand that we need to bring in our best practices. We need to come together to find a common solution so that crazy tariff wars that we're hearing about does not impact us. And I think our trade policies have to be such which have more flexibility than perhaps a yoga instructor has. And I think that's a flexibility we need to work towards, because no amount of agri-tech, though it does change and will change how things are done, but even that cannot really outpace a global supply chain tantrum. And I think that is what we need to resist. That's what we need to come together to ensure what Shirvan just cited is not what countries go through.
Thank you very much, Avi. That's a real practical, I think, lessons and experience. So thank you for that. Also, you reminded me about when India hosted the G20, the Varanasi principles, and how the government is instilling the lifestyle for sustainable, sustainability. So I think India is going into a very progressive way. More importantly, I think, as you spoke about the younger generation, I think urbanization is growing in South Africa specifically. I think we've taken an approach of even instilling hydroponic systems in new developments. Our restaurants are also doing that, capitalizing on the rooftop areas and turning it into hydroponics. So these are some of the innovative ways I think that we can help share with each other. So Robert, very quickly we turn back to you in terms of what are some of the strategic levers to accelerate and adopt technology to ensure this long-term sustainability? If you can just share.
Thanks, Pamela. So because we work at the production end from a technology perspective, we are on the farm every day with farmers across the region. So we always hear about their concerns. And I think that every conversation we hear three same comments. The first is about the climate, whether it's heat stress or water shortages. The second is about labor shortage. This always surprises me. I come from a country of less than 30 million people, and we're in countries with over 1 billion, but farmers are short of labor everywhere in this region. And the third is price, commodity price, crop price. So you think about these concerns, and there are other concerns, but these are the three that we hear most consistently from farmers. So I'm just going to share two technologies, one old and one new, that we think can help with this. And the first is around rice production. Everybody knows most rice is produced in a transplanted, flooded environment. It's worked for a long time and it's been very successful. But we do see more and more countries adopting direct-seeded rice. And this is where the rice seed is planted into a dry field and then water is introduced later in the cropping system. And there's some real advantages to this. It's about 2,500 litres of water is required for every kilo of rice. In a direct-seeded rice environment, there's 30% reduction in water use. There's a 50% reduction in methane emissions, and there's less labour. So there's some real benefits to all of those concerns that we talked about before. But change is hard. Farmers are passionate, hard-working. but they're conservative. So trying to help farmers through this change process comes back to cooperation, collectivism, and helping them understand the benefits. And we've seen some great examples of this. In Vietnam, IRRI, working with the Vietnam government, has a 1 million hectare low emission rice project, which has been very successful. In the northern states of India, where you are from, Haryana, Madhya Pradesh, Punjab, Rajasthan, those state governments, because of the concern of irrigation shortages, are helping farmers with companies like ourselves to adopt and try direct-seeded rice. And here in Indonesia, Sulawesi, direct-seeded rice is very well adopted and works. So these practices can work. This is not a new technology, but there are some significant broad advantages for us and for the environment, and we need to help farmers with these. In terms of a really new technology, many people would have heard of gene editing. Gene editing is a new technology that's been widely adopted in human health, in pharmaceuticals. And just this morning, I looked at a summary of gene editing exploration and investment in agriculture. And it is shockingly broad. Not shocking in a bad way, shocking in a good way. Because gene editing is safe, cheap, and widely available to all organizations. And the breadth of research is coming from governments, academic institutions, private and public institutions. And we've talked about crop nutrition. It's not just about volume. We see some really interesting work on high GABA potatoes for blood pressure, improvement in nutrition of cassava, breeding technology to help with heat stress and heat tolerance, and obviously things like yield. In India, we're working with mustard growers on gene editing to help them with shorter season varieties. And this gives broader area for mustard production, which takes away some of the climate shock which one area may experience. And in Japan, we've worked with the institution and universities on high GABA tomatoes, which are already selling through supermarkets, which help with blood pressure. So gene editing is a very new thing. I know everybody is still learning about this. Many organizations are working in this area, plus governments and institutions. The most important thing for technology adoption for farmers is that countries have clear, easily understood regulatory policies, and wherever possible, they are harmonized across countries so that farmers can safely grow and trade their product, which guarantees them good pricing and marketability of their product. So there's a lot of opportunities to work on climate change, climate issues, and food security, but there's one very old direct-seeded rice, but one very new example in gene editing, where we think, which we think are very important for consideration.
Great, thank you, Robert. Because these innovative ways are also very accessible in terms of, as you said, gene editing, but also helps in the long-term perspective of our health in our country. So, good innovative ways will prevent health in the longer future. So, Judith, very quickly, if you want to just share a little bit on Kenya's perspective in terms of how the dry land, contributes or decontributes to the situation that you have in terms of food security compared to other regions in the continent. Thank you.
Thank you, Pamela. Kenya has several agroecological zones, which means we have the highlands, highly food productive. We have also an arid and semi-arid area. And as it drops down towards the coast and towards Lake Victoria, again, we have areas where predominantly livelihood sources is fishing. And so for us, there's no one particular livelihood source across the country. In so saying, we have farmers, we have fisherfolk, and we have pastoralists. And for this reason, and noting that almost 2/3 of the country is arid and semi-arid, food security therefore becomes a big challenge because we cannot therefore have one solution that fits everybody. And for any of the interventions for food security, this has to be thought through with one, the contribution of local communities. Secondly, the agroecological zone in mind, and thirdly, predominantly what communities, the particular crops that communities grow. But even then, and in looking at livelihood strategies, well, there is need, or rather what we've been doing is to ensure that for example, for traditionally pastoralist communities, try to incorporate agricultural practices. For traditionally agricultural communities, do integrations with, for mixed cropping systems, livestock, and ensure that communities are able to not just grow one crop, but various crops. Incorporate, for instance, in traditionally maize growing communities, incorporate chicken, rabbits, dairy goods. And this means that for households, they're able to have complementary sources for their diets. And like we said, there's need to look beyond just food security, just having food available at the table, but look at the nutrition security. And therefore, if a traditionally grain growing community is able to rear small livestock, and this is chicken, rabbits, and goats, it also means dietary diversity at the household level. And therefore, for this community, we move from not just ensuring food security to nutrition security. And additionally, some of the excess produce is sold, and beyond that, as an income generating activity. In the same way, for traditional fishing communities, do some farming, kitchen gardens, and all that to incorporate, again, additional crops. But even then, this is also a way to build resilience, to give safety nets to households. So if the traditionally grown crop fails, noting that they're not just doing one crop, but various across, one crop is likely to not have failed. Again, if it's also the issue of incorporating small livestock, if crops fail, they have the livestock as a fallback. And for resilience to be built, there is need to invest in agroecology and regenerative practices. And this includes precision agriculture, mixed cropping, rotational farming. So moving crops and livestock around to ensure that the soil is able to regenerate itself and therefore sustainably feed the population and the community. Also among that is sustaining community seed banks, and especially for locally and crops that have traditionally been grown in the area. Seed banks help in ensuring that farmers are able to circulate amongst themselves without the need to get outside the community and have enough seed for the seasons, and also be able to store. Again, this borrows a lot on local and indigenous knowledge, because local communities are able to tell what does best among themselves. They're also able to tell which particular variety, if it's of crop, say for instance, if it's a variety of maize, does well in their agroecological zone. And therefore, most of what we do is ensuring that communities work on what works best for them, and therefore looking inward and anchoring on their strengths.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Judith. We don't have much time, Siobhan and Shavi. I have the job of making food accessible to the audience. So we're just before lunchtime. We'll open up the floor, and then maybe you can intervene and have your parting comments just before we can close the session. So I'll open it up now to any questions that you might have to contribute to this panel discussion. Yes, sir. Please go ahead.
Thank you. My question is to Chavi. In Indonesia, the government has launched this free meal scheme. You have been working at the grassroots, you have been a sarpanch. Could you share with us some of your experiences or impact that you have seen from our school midday meal scheme? That would be very interesting for us to know.
Now?
Sure.
Okay, all right. So, the question I had was, I was observing some of the comments you all made about the youth who are now also in farmers. So basically farmers, you could be a farmer either by compulsion or by choice, right? And the younger generation with education at the village level or in these areas where farming is big, tends to give them skills which they cannot practice in their immediate neighborhood. And therefore, there's a drain of people migrating to urban areas because they've got these new skills and they apply it in a different location, not where they are from. So are you all doing any initiatives which encourages the young generations to be involved in the future of farming, for example? And if you are already doing so, I'd like to hear some, or if you plan, or you think that there should be certain initiatives that we should do that encourages youth. I'd like your views on that.
Shavi, over to you and then we can address it.
Sure. Thank you. I'm happy to address both the questions, close to my heart. So with reference to the midday meal concept, I think India has really done beautifully because in a lot of regions, in remote villages which did not have enough resources of their own, a lot of the children and young women were not getting the required nutrition, especially mothers-to-be. And to address these challenges, and also the education system, the primary level school education system, unfortunately not as robust as it is in Indonesia, but now falling in place. So, so it kind of addressed two challenges with this one solution of providing a midday meal free to children going to schools. So this ensured that the school attendance increased because a lot of parents then thought there was value to sending their children to schools, which otherwise, traditionally, as we've heard other speakers mention, that farmers tend to be extremely conservative. So much so that a lot of them, the menfolk in particular, would think that the more children they had, the more hands they would have to help them in the fields, but not thinking of the cost implication as far as raising a family is concerned. And areas which did not have and do not have the wherewithal to grow the different kinds of crops and vegetables, nutrition obviously takes a back seat. Where you can't afford to buy these resources or these food items, nutrition goes, again, it takes a back seat. And likewise for mothers-to-be, traditionally, again, the concept is that the woman would think of everyone else and herself right at the end. So the food that was meant for her, she would give to the menfolk or to the children in the household and neglect her own self. So the midday meal, it ensured that children got the right nutrition. So there is, and it also generated employment because it requires an additional resource to cook the food for the children in the schools. So the supply is provided to the schools, looking at the number of students that schools have, and it is cooked by the person who has been given the designated job to cook the meal for them. So that's how it has addressed nutrition. And now the current government has changed it further because it's looking at, as I said, not caloric, but more nutritional value and providing that to the individuals. I'm going to go a little further beyond the scope of the midday meal, which is what is called Anganwadi centers, which is the prenatal and pre-nursery school centers, where again, women are appointed and they know exactly what the needs of individuals in every household in the villages. And they give the feedback to the government that this is where we're falling short of. So as we heard Mr. Kapoor initially mention that a lot of young women and children are anemic. And why is that? Again, because of lack of nutrition. So that feedback is now provided from the villages and given to the government, and that is how challenges are addressed. So the reason I'm reiterating that and bring this in is because I feel it is important that the real stakeholders at the last mile are now seen not just as beneficiaries, but as co-creators. Because when you do that, there's a sense of ownership that kicks in, along with a sense of pride and trust and faith that yes, the system is listening to us and is not just providing to us, but also we are contributing to it. So I think when that shift happens, progress happens even further. Now addressing the other question, if I may just request you to share that again to ensure I got that right. The future of farming, right? Youth and farming. So just to let you know, I chose not to contest again, but I have entered into the field of education essentially to address this very topic. Because across India, I've witnessed and noticed that the youth, especially from the rural scape, does not want to become a farmer. And also the farmers, the parents do not think it is a viable source of income. So therefore the youth, they do not push the youth to get into farming either. But, and this is where my shift in the work that I'm doing in the rural space is that I feel if we can introduce farming, and this is what I've done is I've taken over a defunct girls' college in the village, which has over 500 to 600 students coming from different parts of the rural sector. And the idea is to engage with people such as yourselves and those who are working in the field of agriculture and climate change. The idea is to bring that knowledge to the youth, to make them understand there's a science behind agriculture and it's not, so getting your hands dirty, I've often noticed people who get educated or literate often think that if I work with the soil, then it is below my dignity, when it actually is not, because we are the ones who are feeding the entire globe. And to understand that, to understand the science behind it, to understand what the global impact of climate change can be, and how as an individual, as a farmer, what can you do to be more resilient, is the kind of information, knowledge that I feel needs to be taught, along with technology. Now, again, I repeat myself, unfortunately, the foundation of education at rural schools in India, we're still improvising on it, especially north of India. So we need people to collaborate with who can bring in that knowledge, digital literacy, financial literacy, and agriculture-related literacy. I think that is what needs to come in. And again, addressing the larger topic, I think in policies, apart from regenerative agriculture, as Judith pointed out, we also need water management to be deeply ingrained in these policies and for people to understand why it is important. So again, addressing your question, for the youth to understand that is pertinent. And I think that is what is also important in shaping how our regions are going to progress, especially in the field of food security and farming.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Siobhan, I'll come back to you just to give a final thought, but just to address that point on the youth, I think food security is not exclusive to agriculture. There's also a whole blue economy and fish breeding, farming, etc. What we are doing also is to make sure that we open up that avenue in terms of even accessing the seaweed industry in terms of, the natural products that it can. So there is a big push in terms of the African continent and how, because there's a lot of countries surrounded by the oceans and we're leveraging on those. So I'll want to end by asking you, Siobhan, to give your last thoughts on this topic and on the subject matter. Thank you.
Well, thank you. I mean, look, addressing your question, sir, I think there's a massive opportunity, exciting opportunity. I was listening to Rob and I was thinking, okay, in Sri Lanka, the average yield is like 4.4 tons per hectare. It's very, very low. And it's remained the same for 40 years. So how do we push it up to maybe 15 or 20? I was thinking maybe Rob's direct seed thing is the way to go. I don't know. So there is a lot of exciting entrepreneurial opportunities in agriculture as well. And I think it's also how do we excite young people and bring them into agriculture and make them part of that process. And look, I mean, at the end of the day, India, Sri Lanka, Pakistan, Bangladesh, these are very, very ancient cultures. We've got to find a way of retrofitting Rob's technology with these ancient cultures and figure it out for the future. I'm going to leave you with a beautiful story that I love sharing. It's from the Dharmapada, and I realize I'm 1 minute away from UN lunch, so I'll make it quick. But basically, the idea is an example of a bee that takes pollen from a flower. Observe how it does it. It takes pollen, it builds its hive and makes it very prosperous by taking the pollen. It doesn't hurt the flower, and the result is more flowers through pollination. Think about it. That is how we should think about our development and our future and making it sustainable. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and thank you to our wonderful panel members who have shared from their heart.